bulletin, the message today is freedom in the fire. Freedom in the fire. I read about these trees that's found in a North American forest in California. They're called sequoia trees. Have you ever heard of that? No. Sequoia trees. They're these old, really, really tall trees. They grow up to 300 feet high. Wow. They're so really, really tall. They live for thousands of years. And on the branches they have these cones. You know cones like we find in our trees? And inside the cones are seeds. And the seeds have the potential to become new trees. The only problem is, these cones are so tightly fitted together, they don't open naturally over time. They can only open by fire. So when lightning strikes or there's a forest fire, that heat from the fire reaches the cones, and only when the fire hits them do they open up. And then the seeds fall out, fall into the ground, germinate, and then become new trees. It's interesting that the seeds can only come out and reach their potential through the fire. Sometimes we look at fires and we think it's bad. Oh no, there's a fire, there's a forest fire. Most of the time when there's a fire, people run out, especially in the forest. I'm not talking about suburban areas. Residential areas, there must never be a fire because people's lives are at risk. But outside, in nature, when there's a fire, people run out and they put water on it. You know what the experts say? They say that's actually wrong. They say that we're doing more damage to the environment. That fire needs to burn. It needs to burn away all the dead trees and all the underbrush so that new trees, new life, new plants can grow. So the life is found in the fire. It's the same as you and I. We are just like those cones. Inside of you right now, there's seeds of greatness, seeds of potential and purpose, gifts and talents that you don't know you even have. And they can only come out through the fire, through adversity, through pain, through discomfort. And let's be honest, we don't like the fire. We don't like discomfort and pain. We don't want to be uncomfortable. But sometimes you can only reach the next level of your destiny, your truest, highest potential, by going through the fire. Sometimes in life, God will allow you to pass through the fire. And when those fires come around you and you feel uncomfortable, feel a bit of discomfort, it's in those fires that we start to unleash your true potential. If you look at the psalmist David, he wrote in Psalms, he said, God, you enlarge me in my distress. That's interesting wording. God, you enlarge me in my distress, in my discomfort, in my pain, in my misery. That's how you enlarge me. And what a beautiful way to look at it. You see, God enlarges you and blesses you and favors you while you're going through those hardships. David would never have become the greatest king of Israel if he had never gone through the fires, through the trials. He was saying, God, you enlarged me when I had to defeat Goliath, a giant, twice my size. God, you enlarged me when everyone was against me and I couldn't obtain the throne of Israel. God, you enlarged me in my discomfort, in my pain. Just like you and I, like the cone, like David, sometimes we can only reach our best potential. Those gifts and talents that you and me you have can come out only through the fire. And it's a beautiful story in the Bible that gives us this metaphor. It's a story of King Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace. So let's look at that. We're going to read, it's on your bulletin, we're going to read from Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. It says this. Then a herald cried out. A herald is someone who comes, do you know is it the Eastern Province herald? What's a herald? Herald, is this still herald? Yeah. A herald is someone who comes out in the olden days, before papers, they used to come out and say the news. That's what a herald was. They used to come out and say, everybody listen to the news today. So this is what a herald is. He comes out and he cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples and nations and languages, that the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre and the psaltery, when all the musical instruments are being played, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning, fiery furnace. So this happens during what's called the Babylonian exile. King Nebuchadnezzar was a bit of a nutball of a guy, and he decided he wanted to conquer Israel. He's from Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. Have you heard of Iraq? Iraq, that's where Babylon was. So he came from Iraq and he came to Israel to conquer them. And he besieged the city of Jerusalem. Now, if you know about Jerusalem, it's the capital city of Israel. It's the most greatest, glorious one. This is where all the kings reign from. He put his ladders up on the walls. In those days, they had walls around the city. It was fortified walls. He broke down those walls and he burned the city to the ground. He killed whoever he could kill. Anybody that was not dead, he took as slaves back to Babylon. This is what we call the Babylonian captivity or exile. And they were there for 70 years. You're right here. It lasted for 70 years. And during this time, he took all of the men that were still alive in Israel, in Judah, in Jerusalem, and he took them with him. With these men was one guy called Daniel. We just read his part out of his book. He wrote this book about the story of the exile in Babylon. And also he tells us about 3 other men. And maybe you know these names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's here, Tony. Alright. It's weird names, eh? You know those 3 names are actually Babylonian names. It's not their Hebrew names. They had names like I would have been Raymond. And they would have said, no, you're not Raymond, you are now Pig Pompis. And then I would have become another name. That's what they'd done. So all the Israelites, these young Jewish men, came into exile into Babylon, and they had to learn new cultures and new ways of speaking. They even got new names. And one day this king, this bit of a nutball of a king, King Nebuchadnezzar, he built a statue for himself, 100 feet tall. You're all around Uteman, right? Do you know where Church Street is? Do you know where Caledon Street is? On the corner is the old post office. Are you familiar with the old post office in Uteman? On the corner is that long tower with a clock on it. It's called Victoria Tower. Do you know that? That tower is 100 feet tall. That's about the same size as this image that he built. And if you're ever in the area, you'll see it's quite a tall building. So this is this huge statue, 100 feet, total gold, the image of himself. And he said to all the people, when you hear the music, when my son and I play the music, all of you must bow down and worship this image. He didn't believe in God, he didn't care. So he called all the people from all over the nation. And he said, come down, we're going to play the music. Guys, when the music plays, everyone bow down and worship the statue. So the music starts to play, and all of a sudden everybody bows down and worships the statue, this image. All except 3 people. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 Hebrew boys were there. And they said, no, this isn't right. We can't worship another idol. We worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're not going to bow down to this statue. And people saw this. And they ran to the king and said, oh, king, there's some guys out there. They don't follow our customs. And they don't believe in our God. And they don't worship the image that you made. Oh, the king was furious. He said, bring me these boys. They brought these 3 young men to him. And he said, guys, I know you. He actually already promoted him. So Nebuchadnezzar already knows these 3 guys. He says, guys, I don't know if you didn't get the memo or the message, but when the music plays, you must bow down and worship the image. He said, I'll give you another chance. All right, we're going to play the music, and now you 3 guys bow down and worship the image. You know what they said? They said, hell no. They didn't say exactly hell no. They said, no. You don't have to play the music, king, because we will never, ever bow down and worship that image. You can do what you want, but we are not going to worship that image. And you know what he said? He said, oh, well, that's it. You know what the consequence is? 7 times. He said, if you don't bow down, I'm going to throw you into the fire. And you're going to burn to death. You've all had brides before, right? A bride at home. You know, I'm English, so I don't do brides good. My brides always die. I never get the fire going. It's really pathetic, honestly. But I've been to Dispatch. Dispatch these Afrikaans boeremanasel, and they know how to have a fire. I don't know if you've ever been to a fire with an Afrikaans person, but the fire is as big as this room. And they put wood on there, and the fire goes for hours. And I'm hungry, and I want to eat a boerewors, but you don't get it because the fire is so big. That's like this. The fire was going, and he says, no, I'm going to have to put it hotter. He says, guys, put more wood on there. Make it hot as you can. They grabbed these 3 Hebrew boys. Young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Bound them up. And the 2 soldiers, guards, that took them and threw them in, they died. It was so hot that the guards that threw them in died because of the fire. Man, can you imagine that? Now these 3 boys are thrown into the fire. And in our mind, they are burning to death. You can imagine maybe screams and cries as the skin is melting off of their bodies. But that's not what happened. He didn't get any screams. And the king is very curious and he says, what's going on here? Shouldn't I be screaming by now? If I just stump my toe, I'll cry out in pain. And if I'm in a fire, I'll be screaming. But they weren't. The king says, and he looks into the fire, and he looks, and he says to his guards, didn't we throw 3 men in there? They said, yes, we threw 3 men. He says, why is it that I see 4 men in the fire? All of a sudden, there's a 4th person in the fire.
And the one looks like the Son of God.
Did you hear that? And he says this, the one looks like the Son of God. And we know from the New Testament that there's only one Son of God. And his name is?
Jesus.
His name is Jesus. So can you imagine that 600 years before Jesus came onto the scene, this king saw Jesus in the fire with these men. And he was completely beside himself. He said, what's going on here? And you know what he does? He calls them out. Because they weren't dead. They weren't burning. He sees them and they're walking around in the fire with this 4th person in between them. And he says, guys, come out here. Can you imagine calling someone out of the fire? There's madness. They come out. They're not burnt. They're not even smelling like smoke.
Not even had to eat that was
Nothing. They were completely, the only thing that was burnt, believe it or not, was the ropes that bound them. Can you believe that? That's the best part of the story. They go in, they're bound, they come out set free. The only thing that was burnt was the chains and the ropes that bound them in the first place. They come out, it's such a miracle that King Nebuchadnezzar is beside himself. He says, well guys, listen, we're going to start worshipping the God of these guys. Because he's the true God. And then guys said, no, what about the statue? He said, no, forget the statue, man. That's a dead idol. We're going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Abednego, Shadrach, and Meshach. A beautiful story that tells us about the trials of life, the trials by fire. The stranger Peter, in his book in the New Testament, says that he says this, don't count it strange when you go through trials of fire. Isn't it interesting? He uses those same words, fire. And he says, don't count it strange. Don't be surprised when you go through trials of fire. And you know what? Believe it or not, Christians, every day we're surprised when we go through things. You notice that? Oh, I'm sick today. Oh, somebody died. Oh, there's a war in Ukraine. It's like it never happened before. Believe it or not, the last 6,000 years, there has been sickness, there has been wars, and there has been death. And we've all been through it. And you think, oh, I'm sick, or I've lost a loved one. You are one of 7 billion people of the last 7,000 years that have been going through exactly the same thing. We all go through trials of fire, obstacles, opposition in our life. And we shouldn't be surprised by it. It's a part of this thing called life. And you know what? Most of the time, God will not take away the obstacle. Think about these 3 Hebrew boys. At any time, God could have just thrown water on the fire. Couldn't he have done that? He could have just put his hand down and said, no, these guys are not going into that fire. He could have just broken it. He could have taken the 3 boys and moved them to another country. God could have done anything. But do you realize that he left them to go into the fire? He let them go in. In our life, the obstacles and the trials and the tribulations and the pain we go through, most of the time God won't take it away. But he'll give you the strength to go through it. And that's the beauty of being a Christian. Sometimes we just pray, God, take it away, take it away. Most of the time, God says no. But I'm going to be with you as we walk through this fire. I'm going to be the 4th man in the fire. And not only will you come out of the fire, but you'll come out better off than you were before. Do you know what the king done to those 3 Hebrew boys when they came out? He promoted them. He promoted them. In your mind, he should have maybe killed them again. But he came out and he says, just because of that, I'm going to promote you to a higher position. When you come out of the trials of fire, it's not happy being in there. When we go through the trials of fire, it's painful and it's a little heartache and it's sore. But when you come out, you will be better off than when you went in. And that's a promise that God gives us. Not only will he be there in the fire with us, but when we come out, we'll have lessons learned. We'll learn from our mistakes. We'll learn. There's lessons to be learned in the fire, in the trials. And sometimes you don't get that in the fire. When you're going through pain and heartache, you don't get no lessons. It's only many years later, maybe you look back and see how God worked in your life, other people's lives. And at that time, you say, wow, thank you, God, that I went through that trial because I'm better off than when I went in. In our lives,
And
yeah,
did
sorry.
you notice that Daniel was not invited?
Why wasn't he invited?
Because he would never have done it.
No, he would have never have done it. The question is, I've asked it myself, Daniel, why wasn't Daniel there? Because he's the guy who wrote the story. First of all, he would never bow down, we know that. So there would have actually been 4 men. But the people say that he wasn't there because he was probably somewhere else in the country. He was also in a position of power. He had to run all the different cities in Babylon. And he was probably just not there at the day. That's probably what they say. But he would never bow down to that. We know that from Daniel in the lion's den. So the story of going through trials of fire. Sometimes we look at the fire and we think, oh man, this fire is going to consume me. It's so out of control. I'll never get to bed. Do you know that forest rangers in forest, they do something called a controlled burn. They'll go to a section of the forest and they'll burn it down on purpose. Do you know that?
Or regrow.
Say that again.
Regrow.
Regrowth. Did you get that? That's what they do. They go and say, this section here we're going to burn down, guys. And they're calling it off and they burn it down. Because they're burning all the dead wood and all the bush underneath. Because when it's all dead, then new trees can grow, new plants can grow. It's a sign of vitality, a sign of life. It's the same for you and me. Sometimes the fire seems overwhelming, but it's not. God knows the limit and the intensity of the fire and the problem you're going through. And He won't let it get out of control. That's not the God we serve. He says, yes, you're all going through a trial. This is it, and this is how long it will last, and this is how bad it's going to be. And you'll get out of that fire. It's a control burn. The devil wants you to believe that it's out of control. And that fire is going to whip through your life and you're never going to come out of this one. No. We have a God that knows not only how big the fire is, but how to get us through the fire. And He's going to give us the strength. The beautiful verse in Philippians says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Do you know that verse? It's a familiar verse. If we know what happens before that, we'll understand that in that verse, Paul is talking about the things he's been through. He says, I've had it all, I've lost it all. I've been happy and I've been sad. I've been healthy and I've been hurting. He says, I've been up and down. That's life. That's life. Every day, every moment, we're happy, sad, we go through things. And he says, and you know, in all of this hardship and trials I've been through, I can make it. He says, I can get through it. And then he says, why? Because Christ gives me strength to go through it. And that's the beauty of being a Christian in this sometimes horrible thing we call life. Because we go through losses of life. We've all been through it. We go through sickness and pain. You've been through that. We go through relational issues that are just horrible. And we go through these hardships. And God is saying, well, I'm not going to take it away, but you know what? I'm going to give you the strength to get through it. There's a beautiful story I read about this man called Salvador Sabina. That's probably how they pronounce it, but I'll say it normally. Salvador Sabina. Alright, he was brought up in South America, very rough neighborhood. He was always involved in fights and gangs, even from a young age. At the age of 8, he saw his grandfather stab someone to death. That's like, man, that's horrible. But at the age of 11, he personally had witnessed 4 murders. Have you ever witnessed a murder?
No.
How can you witness 4 at the age of 11? That's how bad the environment was. That's how bad the place he lived in. He was always surrounded by violence and anger, and the spirit seemed to just be with him like forever. He eventually moved to New York City, to the Bronx. The Bronx is a very, very bad neighborhood in New York City. Gangs, violence, crime, it's the worst. And he just got caught up in this gangs and this violence and this crime. In and out of jail. At one time he actually shot at a policeman. That's how bad it was. Eventually all his sins and crimes caught up to him. He was arrested and he spent a lifetime in jail. A life sentence with 14 counts against him. 14 criminal counts. So he didn't just go for one thing. He went for rape, for murder, for stealing, for robbery, for you name it. 14 different. Can you imagine a judge looking at this guy thinking, you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail. And he sentenced him to life imprisonment for 14 counts. He was in prison, and one day he wrote to his mom, and he wanted a book on spirits. Spirits, ghosts, demons, spirits. Because he believed that he was cursed. He believed that because all of this violence and stuff, he was cursed. So he wrote his mom and said, Mom, give me a book on spirits. I want to find out about curses and spirits. She got hold of a friend of hers who was into the occult and witchcraft. And anyway, they sent him a book. The book arrived, he opened up the book, and believe it or not, it was the Bible.
Praise
The Holy Bible.
Praise
He was
God.
shocked. He was furious. He threw it down. He said, "Oh, this is like the worst." You know what happened the next morning? He woke up and he started to read that Bible, the New Testament. You know what? He finished reading the New Testament in 4 days.
Phew.
That's your challenge for this week. You've got 1 week to read the New Testament. Do you think you can do that? It's not impossible. This guy read the whole New Testament in 4 days. And on the 5th day, he woke up and he said, I've read this, I understand it, but he hasn't received Jesus. He doesn't know about God yet. And he made a negotiation with God. Remember, this is a guy that doesn't know God or Christianity. The best he could do was this. He said, "God, if you are alive, like you say you are in the Bible, then come into my cell and save me." That's all he wanted. He didn't want to get out. He didn't want riches or fame. He just wanted salvation. He wanted to be free of this life, this curse that was on him. The next morning, 5:30, in his prison cell, while it was still dark and quiet, he heard a voice call out, "Salvador." He looked around. There was nobody there. He was alone in his cell. No one can get in or out. So he thought he must be dreaming. He went back to bed. Again he heard the voice, "Salvador." He woke up and he thought, "I must be going crazy because I keep on hearing somebody call my voice." The 3rd time he heard the voice saying, "Salvador." And in that moment he knew that it was God coming to him in his cell to call him to salvation. Right there and there he fell on his knees and he gave his life to God. He became a Christian.
Amen.
Amen. You know what the miracle is? After that, he went to spread the gospel around the different prisoners. Against all odds, by the grace of God, that life sentence was dropped down to 4 years.
Praise the Lord.
Can you believe it? He was going to rot in prison. But he found God, and God just seemed to change things around for him.
180 degrees.
180 degrees. He spent 4 years. Today, this man, Salvador Sabina, has a beautiful big church in the Bronx. He's a minister, and he's preaching the gospel to people, telling them, "Listen, I went through a trial of fire. I've been through the fire. I've been there. I've done it, man."
What a testimony.
What a testimony. But God has brought me through it. He was the 4th man in my fire. He was not going to let me see my end. He was not going to see me burn. He brought me out, not only out, but better off than I was before. Just like this, man, we all go through trials of fire. And it looks like it's out of control. It looks like we're going to see our end. It looks like there's no way forward for us. But the truth is, God is that 4th person in your fire with you. And He's going to give you the strength and the courage and the faith and the mercy to fight any battle that you fight. There will be another day. There will be tomorrow when you wake up. And you will know that God is with you through the fire. And with that, I'll let this lady just sit down before I close by saying this. For all of us who go through trials of fire, testings, there is favor in that fire. There is purpose, lessons to be learned from that fire. And there is freedom in the fire. And we all say, Amen.